Welcome to What Has My Attention, and this is John Beethan. In a meeting not long ago at the Chamber of Commerce in Carlsbad, I had the pleasure to hear Andria Taylor give a remarkable presentation. Her discourse, Once Upon a Time, The Power of Storytelling for Your Business, was both delightful and insightful, and I knew it needed a wider audience. And so I convinced her to join me in the studio to share her wisdom in a professional audio format. Her tale was originally released as an episode on our Imagine Podcasting podcast, complete with a transcript and chapter markers for your convenience. But the power of her message, especially in this era where amplifying women's voices is of paramount importance, convinced me to present it to you here again at What Has My Attention. It's a compact but potent 16-minute episode, a time really well spent. And if you need to reach out to me, you'll find me through the contact page on imaginepodcasting.com. There are links in the show notes for everything she talks about, including how to get in touch with me as well. So here and now, Once Upon a Time. Welcome, Andria Taylor.
Thank you, John Beethan. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's always great to work with you, and I just want to let everybody know that Andria and I have been working together here at the Carlsbad Chamber of Commerce, but I wanted to bring her on What Has My Attention and also my Imagine Podcasting, both podcasts, mainly because there's some really great tips here about storytelling, and Andria is a fantastic presenter. If you ever get a chance to see her live, don't delay. Just buy that ticket if that's what it takes. So anything that inspired you to actually do this? You wanted to?
It's a great question. And yes, there's so much power in being able to stand up in front of people and present in a way and tell stories in a way that moves them. And if I can help people, one, just have more confidence in, making a presentation or connecting with people, and using their power of their story, that's what really inspires me around this, because there's a lot of different tips and ways you can do that. And people love story. So it's a great way to include. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it today.
And how do you see it actually being useful for podcasters?
I think podcasting is all about telling stories.
You go.
Right? So I think everyone has a story to tell, John. And unless you ask them and find out what they're passionate about, what their interests are, that's, to me, the beauty of storytelling.
Yep. Well, I tell new podcasters regarding doing interviews and stuff, I said, there's only 3 words you need to say in the podcast.
Tell me more.
Or, what's your story?
There you go. What's your story? That's perfect.
Yeah. So without further ado, Andria, you want to introduce the presentation?
Yes, I'd love to. The presentation that I'm talking about today is storytelling, how to use storytelling to engage people, particularly with your business, because I think it's an underutilized opportunity to really help sell our businesses and make those connections. So I'm going to cover why storytelling is so powerful. I'm going to talk about what are the elements of a good story and inspire you to think about ways that you can use your story to make your presentations, your connections, and your selling more powerful.
That's great. And I encourage people to check out the show notes, because we will have links to all the resources that she mentions in the presentation. You can always follow us anywhere you get your audio.
Welcome to Once Upon a Time, the power of storytelling for your business. I'm Andria Taylor, Chief Talent Officer for Talent Exponential. And I would love to talk to you today about how you can use storytelling to empower your business. I'd like to begin first with a story about how I found my voice. I remember sitting in the classroom in 6th grade. I actually remember my teacher's name, Mrs. Coleman, and she had asked the class a question. And I raised my hand to respond. And as I spoke, I noticed that the rest of the class was listening to my voice. And it was such a powerful experience, especially in a 6th grade classroom, when you realize that your voice has presence. And that began my journey to finding my voice in my profession and in telling stories, particularly with presentations. I would say that I grew up in a family that I didn't necessarily find my voice because my mom was very talkative. She's a natural communicator. So I don't think I really found my voice in my family. But as I began to go through my schooling and in grad school, I was mastering in adult education. And I had to do a presentation for one of my classes. So it was actually a video presentation. So what I actually did was I decided to make it as interesting as possible, and I began the presentation by speaking another language. And I said, Добрый день, меня зовут Andria Taylor, и я учительница сегодня, which in Russian means, good morning, my name's Andria Taylor, and I am going to be your teacher today. And it was such a fun experience, and it was very well received. That really began my journey on learning how to give presentations and tell stories. After grad school, my first job was working with a consulting firm that worked with large construction companies, and I learned more about rebar than I ever wanted to know. But one of the things that we did was we taught presentation skills. Clients would come in, particularly for sales, they would tell stories, they would be videotaped, we would get feedback. But I really learned how to do a presentation well, the techniques that you learn, and really improving presentation skills. As I expanded my career and began training and engaging with adults, I learned the power of storytelling. And that's really what I'd like to share today. When you think about stories, we are really hardwired for stories. Our brains are literally hardwired for a story. You remember a story from a presentation where you don't remember all the facts. The power of someone sharing how they changed their life, how they lost 20 pounds. Those things are inspirational. You even think about over in the centuries we've been alive that we had oral history before written history, that we carried on traditions and doctrines and religion and culture through story. So it's been a part of our culture forever. Stories really can bring data and facts to life. And stories engage emotions where data and facts do not. It's great information, but you really want to engage people's heart and their minds in telling a story. It just makes the process of learning and selling so much more memorable. And you think about stories, particularly for business, we tell stories to entertain people. Humor is always a great part of a presentation, telling a funny story, but it can also really educate people. It can persuade people on an emotional level where just the facts and information do not. So we can use stories to sell as well. Let's talk a little about the physiology. I have an article from NPR called How Stories Connect and Persuade Us, Unleashing the Brain Power of Narrative. And this article talks about how when you see or hear a really compelling story, your brain participates in a phenomenon known as narrative transportation. So when you begin to listen to a story, your brain waves actually start to synchronize with those of the storyteller. Think about when you hear a story, how you get drawn in. It catches your attention and you start resonating with the storyteller. And so even reading a narrative activates the brain regions involved in deciphering or imagining a person's motives and perspectives. That's the power of storytelling in, being engrossed in this story, and you start wondering about why people did that and what caused that. So it moves in a whole different part of the brain using that power of story. Think about a story that you heard, a great presentation, or a book you read, even something that you saw on Instagram or TikTok, where that story really captured your attention. It's what drew you in. So think about those stories that really have an impact as you think about how to incorporate stories on your own, whether you're doing a public presentation, whether you're meeting with a client, or whether you're communicating with family. What are some things that make a good story? The first is it's simple. A good story is easy to understand, and it's in a language that matches how your audience communicates. One of the most important things when you're giving presentations is doing audience research, knowing who you're communicating to so that you can really speak their language. If you're talking to a group of parents, that's very different than if you're in a boardroom or you're talking to executives. Simplicity increases memorability. A story is something you should practice. Oftentimes when people tell stories, they go from A to B to X to Y to D and back around. So making sure that that story is succinct and it communicates the emotion and the impact and the power is really important. A good story is also emotional. There should be some emotion like humor, pain, struggle, joy. You can include all three. But those kind of things really engage people and connect us as humans. So think about the story. What's going to be the emotional impact that you want to share? So simple, emotional, and then real. Good stories come from firsthand experience. It can be your experience or it can be someone else's experience. So think about how that story relates directly to you. Share that. Tell it in your own words. It can even be, I had a friend and this happened to them, and sharing that story. But made-up stories are not as valuable as the real stories, and there's so many out there. The fourth thing that makes a good story is it needs to be relevant. A good story works for a lot of audiences, but make sure you tailor the telling to your specific audience. Like I mentioned before, if you're talking to a group of parents, making sure that what you're talking about, whether it's finances or real estate, connects to the value for them as a family. Knowing your audience and what their specific needs are is really going to increase the relevance of your story. So make sure that your stories are simple, they have an emotional hook or connection, they're real, and that they're relevant. What's really most important about stories, particularly when you want to sell with a story, and this comes from Paul Smith, and his book is called Sell with a Story. And he says, the first and the most important thing you need to understand about storytelling is not the structure of a great story, how to use emotion or surprise properly, or even how to deliver your story in front of an audience. The most important part of storytelling is knowing when to tell a story and choosing the right story to tell. At the end of my podcast, I have some resources which includes this information from Paul Smith, a wealth of information that you can use when you're looking to sell with story and influence and persuade people. Do you wonder where you might use a story? Here's 5 places I think of where I could use a story in my business as I work with medium-sized businesses and leadership development, etc. I could use a story about how I influenced leadership development, how I helped someone be prepared for their next role in a LinkedIn post. Of course, I want to have stories, client testimonials on my website, or a story about how I helped a client. That's what a case study is about. In networking, having a story where you make a difference is very important. Of course, you can include it in a sales presentation or a product testimonial. So there's so many places that you can use a story rather than just facts about a product or what you do, but it really shares with a story how you make a difference in people's lives. It brings it to life. Let me tell you about a time where I used my skills and my abilities and I really made a difference. So those are 5 simple places that you could use a story. As I mentioned, Sell with a Story by Paul Smith. He has 25 most useful sales stories on a spectrum from introducing yourself all the way through to preparing for a sales call, building rapport, closing a sale, continuing that customer relationships. He has 25 places that you can use a story. So a lot of great information where you can use stories that are just really powerful to make the connection with people and tell about the benefits and that results what your service delivers. Here's a couple storytelling prompts. If you were to think about some great questions to help you get thinking about storytelling, one question I like is, what's the best advice you've ever been given? thinking about who gave you some great advice that changed the trajectory of your career or really helped you be brave and take a step into a new field. Another question is, tell us about a breakthrough moment. Think about what's a breakthrough moment that you had or a client had that really made a big difference and where they saw tremendous results. Tell us about a time you had to follow your heart. I'd lean in and listen to that one. How about a time that you've delighted a customer? This is one that I've borrowed from our Carlsbad chamber meetings. It's a great question. When's the time when you've delighted a customer? When you've done such an amazing job or went over and above and just had a customer that was so excited. Those are just a couple storytelling prompts of think about a story and where you could incorporate it. Think about how you can use stories, whether it's to sell your product or service, make a point, or give a speech. If you've ever heard an amazing presentation, whether it can be even from a political candidate, if you go to a sales presentation, you're going to hear stories, right? Because it just brings the presentation to life. It helps make a point. So think about how can you improve what you want to communicate with a good story. So I want to leave you with that thought and thinking about how you can better incorporate storytelling in your presentations, in your work, as you network with people. At the end of this presentation, you'll find some great storytelling references. Some of the articles that I talked about, the NPR, Storytelling's Power to Connect Us, an article from Forbes, Your Brain on Storytelling, Why We Love Narrative E-Learning, and also the book I mentioned on Sell with Story. So please take a look at those. There's links embedded that you'll be able to access those. There's so many great resources out there for storytelling. So I just want to thank you for taking time to talk about how to use story to sell and to make connections with people as you grow your business. I'm Andria Taylor, Chief Talent Officer of Talent Exponential. You can visit my website. Thank you.